One of the most common criticisms of Lost can be summed up in one sentence: they were making it up as they went along. Other variations of this criticism include they had no plan and just strung viewers along for 6 seasons, or the writers were con artists who made promises they had no intention of keeping. The show just asked question after question with no idea of what the answers were. These criticisms have been fairly pervasive over the years, and sometimes even a little bit pernicious. The problem with the whole discourse surrounding this question is the fact that it only exists at the extremities. Hardcore fans want to defend every creative decision of the writers' room, with some even claiming that they absolutely had everything planned and rarely, if ever, dropped the ball. While long-term haters of the show will counterclaim that they had no plan at all and winged their way across 6 seasons of storytelling, dropping said ball frequently. Neither of these statements are true, of course, and both seek to have this debate only in binary terms. It's either all, or it's nothing. The writers were either geniuses, or the writers were frauds. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm tired of these two groups having the controlling interest in how these discussions are had. The truth, as it is with almost everything, is somewhere in between, and we will explore how and why that is. Lost wasn't always a perfectly formed diamond. It had its rough edges. Like most stories, Lost had enough ups and downs that someone could reasonably come away from the experience questioning if it really had been planned out in any significant way. They want the show to make sense. They want to know that the journey's ultimate end destination was absolutely intended. Now, I have tried my best to lay out the facts of the mythology in my videos in order to combat some of these opinions, and I have even managed to turn some of those opinions around. My primary goal with this channel has been to deepen and/or enrich the mythology of the show for fans, and I also very much hope to convert former fans who felt betrayed or let down by the eventual direction that the show took. But it takes time to explain 120 hours worth of complex mythology, with dozens upon dozens of character arcs and backstories, detailed main plots and subplots, numerous existential and metaphysical concepts, and recurring themes and philosophies. This cannot simply be done in one 20-minute video. And I'll never convince everyone, of course. There are former fans who lost faith in the series, or felt betrayed by its ending, and they've never really gotten over those perceptions of betrayal. But even the most vicious and vociferous critics of Lost started out as fans. You have to have had love for a show, or have been invested long enough in it, to end up feeling such long-lasting hatred. If you don't like or don't care about something from the beginning, then you don't really care where it goes or how it ultimately ends. All of this stems from a place of love and passion, no matter how fleeting that love and passion may have been for some viewers. But the myth about Lost having been one giant long con on audiences has lingered over its ultimate legacy. I felt that it was time to set the record straight on this issue to the best of my capabilities. This is a video as much for the non-converted as it is for the already converted, for both fans and detractors alike. But I think it's only right to let the showrunners tell us, in their own words, about all of this up front.
The metaphor we like to use is that we know we're taking a road trip from Los Angeles to Boston, and we get up every day, and Damon and I come into the office, and we don't know on a given day whether we're going to take a rural highway or whether we're going to take the interstate, or whether our car is going to break down and we're going to hitchhike. But we know that we have plans to go to certain cities. We're going to go to Omaha, we're going to go to St. Louis, we're going to go to Minneapolis, we're going to go to Wall Drug in South Dakota.
I don't want to go to Minneapolis.
No, see, so if Damon says he doesn't want to go to Minneapolis, then we decide, okay, well, screw that, we'll go to Evanston instead. So, you know, we don't have we do have a general plan as to where we're going, but I think what keeps the show organic and real is the fact that we write the episodes episode by episode, and we really try to we feed a lot on what the show tells us. We feed on the relationships we see that develop between the characters. We what kind of dynamics and what sort of pairings work between certain characters. Certain pieces of mythology the audience really responds to, and then we decide to spend more time on those aspects of the mythology. And so it's kind of an organic thing. We guide the show, but we also listen to the show a lot in terms of it telling us what it wants to be.
And then, obviously, the LA to Boston analogy sort of is a season-by-season analogy. Obviously, JJ and I, created the show sort of, for those of you who do have the DVD, very much on the fly. It was, over a course of very few weeks, sort of designing exactly what the pilot was going to be. Carlton came on very shortly after that, and obviously all of us started talking about sort of the bigger picture in terms of, well, if we're starting in Los Angeles, how are we going to end up in, Minsk? So it's like season.
Minsk?
Yeah, exactly. Well, see, it's hard to get to Minsk. Season 3 is we will port out of Boston and cross the Atlantic and land somewhere in Europe, and we'll have to figure out that. But we're gradually there's a big picture within the bigger picture. So it's always in service of that, because I feel obviously as fans.
You're not going to tell them about the time travel.
No.
Okay.
I'm not going to at all. I mean, in fact, I'm going to go back in time right now and prevent you from having said that.
Oh my God. The truth is we don't have like some Bible of the show that we're just sitting here, typing up every week and then having margaritas. I mean, we know these sort of mythological milestones that exist, but the journey between them is one that we discover along the way, and in that process of discovery, things sometimes change, and that's the way the show gets written.
Now, I'd say that's a fairly consistent position that they maintained between the years 2005 and 2010. But look, let's not just take their word for it. Let's actually interrogate the show and their comments to find out once and for all if they were really making it up as they went along. And to answer this question, to understand how and why the show ended up where it ended up, we need to go back to how it all began. In the early days of Lost Season 1, it was most certainly true that the creative team were making things up on the fly, and we know this because the writers have actually been very candid about the development process in various interviews over the years, right from the very start in fact. Question: do you have a long-term plan for the show? J.J. Abrams. What we have right now is a really great end of year 1, and a really great end of year 2. Now, whether that ends up happening is anyone's guess. If we're lucky enough to keep going, the end of year 2 might not happen until year 5. I always say it's like driving in the fog, where you can vaguely make out where you're going, the shape of the place, and you're heading there. But you're going to find roads you never saw or thought you'd take. In fact, the closer you get, you might realise, oh, that wasn't it at all. I'm going there. You have to have a direction. Season 1 was essentially a testing ground for what Lost could be and where it might go. No idea was off the table, but everything was on the line. Here is a very brief history of the show's inception. In the summer of 2003, ABC executive Lloyd Braun pitched the idea of what he described as Castaway the series, inspired by the movie starring Tom Hanks. Based on Braun's idea, writer Jeffrey Lieber was hired to craft a story for a realistic portrayal of life on a deserted island. His pitch was indebted to Lord of the Flies, and to a lesser extent the reality TV show Survivor. Braun later brought successful TV showrunner J.J. Abrams aboard to rewrite the idea and create a new pilot script. Abrams wanted to make this more of a genre show and enlisted the talents of Damon Lindelof to help him craft a series bible. Now, a series bible is essentially a large pitch document that explains the ethos of what the TV show is going to be, including character profiles and episode ideas. They are designed to secure a green light for development. As a result, this document gave certain assurances over how far the series could go in terms of its mysteries and reveals. In order to get that all-important green light, every seemingly fantastical mystery required a grounded explanation. But a series bible is not created as a mission statement to the fan base, because it's not intended for public consumption. However, this document was leaked online some years later, which compounded an already ongoing problem. the conflation between assurances that the creators made to the network with what the creators had promised to deliver us, the audience. So what exactly was in this series Bible? Well, episode suggestions were included to fit the paradigm of the pitch, including many ideas that were never actually explored, and these suggestions married up to the guarantees of crafting storylines grounded in survivor relationships and survival themes. Some of the most basic pitches included the survivors spending an entire episode trying to combat sunburn or food poisoning, with more elaborate plot lines that included the survivors holding an actual island election to decide who their leader would be, and an episode that would see the implementation of a sort of kangaroo court in which Locke would be the equivalent of a Spanish inquisitor prosecuting Charlie, and Kate would become the crusading public defender, as if we were watching a Sidney Lumet movie on the beach. Just thinking about some of these ideas makes me cringe. This is the show the network really wanted, and the show we could have had. We should be glad it didn't go down this hokey old road, and that the writer's room came up with much better ideas. Yes, there is a clear statement of intent that the series would have self-contained episodes and not rely upon a serialised mythology. This is the most infamous part of this document, mainly because we now know it was a bait and switch. Lindelof explained to Slash Film that they had ulterior motives from the start. We made a very specific effort in this document to say we were not going to be serialised, we were not going to be genre, and we were not going to do what Alias had done. So even though I think it was our intention to do all of the above, we needed to put that in the document, because the document was essentially a letter to ABC saying, here's what the show is going to be. Braun greenlit the pilot based off the ideas contained within the Bible, and before anyone knew it, they were casting the project without a finished script. From this reconception by Abrams and Lindelof, the entire pilot was put together in just 12 weeks, including writing, casting, and production, with Abrams directing. By the time the show had been ordered to series by ABC, Braun had left ABC and Abrams had been lured away to make the new Mission Impossible movie with Tom Cruise, leaving Lindelof with the keys to the kingdom. The young 30-year-old writer was now in charge of this runaway hit, and found himself quickly struggling to keep up with the demands of the show.
Every episode had to have multiple stories, a story that was happening on the island and a story that was happening in the past relating to one of these characters. And if we could do it just right, there'd be a thematic resonance between the two. So the degree of difficulty in making an episode of Lost was very, very high. And I was the boss. So when JJ left, which was right after the pilot got picked up, he was like, you are gonna run the show. And I was the CEO of what amounted to be a $60 million a year corporation with no management experience. I was a writer, and I was not prepared to manage the show, let alone overcome the creative obstacles at that speed and that rate of time.
The writer's room was under various restrictions from the network over where they could take this concept. ABC wanted a straight-up survival drama show and a playing down of the more overt genre elements. And as the new figurehead of this gravy train, Lindelof had to placate their wishes and reassure everyone that they were going to be more Castaway and less X-Files. Which leads me to an interview Lindelof gave to Sci-Fi Wire in 2005. In it, he absolutely does reinforce the expectation that Lost would not go full-blown sci-fi or fantasy. Here's the quote: "We're still trying to be firmly ensconced in the world of science fact. I don't think we've shown anything on the show yet that has no rational explanation in the real world that we all function within. We certainly hint at psychic phenomena, happenstance, and things being in a place where they probably shouldn't be, but nothing is flat out impossible. There are no spaceships, there isn't any time travel." Now this is a bit of a gotcha quote when looking back, and I can understand why it gets rolled out as so-called evidence of a wider deception by those looking to tie a noose around the neck of the show. But we need to factor in the context of when this quote was given. The original article has since been removed, but it has been attributed as taking place in January of 2005, which means it was conducted sometime during the halfway point in Season 1. Why does this matter, you may ask? because Lindelof and his team had not settled on the overall direction of the series at this point. None of them claim that they knew where the overall narrative was heading, and several of the collaborators involved with Year One have openly discussed how it was a process of trial and error. Nothing was set in stone. It was a brainstorm of possible storylines and directions that they could travel in. Furthermore, Lindelof was in a tough spot here. He couldn't publicly say that, yes, we would like to trigger full-blown genre madness with this story, and do ghosts, time travel, demigods and immortal humans, because he was new to being a showrunner and still fully answerable to the network, a network that was keeping a watchful eye over their newborn. In other words, he had to toe the party line. Serialised mythologies were not commonplace on TV in 2005, and it was risky to use this smash hit show as the vessel for experimentation. Audiences were used to procedural shows with self-contained episodes that they could drop in and out of each week. They were simple to follow, and that format had been the bread and butter of networks for decades. This is why both context and fairness matters when digging up old quotes. Now here's the thing about all of this. Critics spend a lot of time using the series Bible or old quotes from the early days as a smoking gun to say, you see, they lied from the start. Yet they almost always neglect to mention the many ideas that did end up making it into the show from the series Bible. Ideas which actually help to demonstrate how certain mythological milestones were baked into the narrative from its very conception. From individual episode plotlines about finding a hatch in the ground, to bigger picture concepts such as the island having an ancient past and history to it, as well as plans for there to be a think tank of some kind that created a network of underground complexes for the purposes of experimentation. These are big deal parts of the mythology, and they were already being considered and fleshed out from the beginning. They may not have thought about calling that think tank the Dharma Initiative, or that the ancient island history would involve a cave of light and an ancient stone cork, but the groundwork was most definitely there from before the pilot was even written. Even the character profiles are filled in with a surprising amount of detail that actually made it into the first season. Locke is accurately summed up. We even get details about Kate that we don't fully learn until season 2. And Sun and Jin's complicated backstories are pretty much bang on the money, with a particular emphasis placed upon the fact that they are unable to conceive, clearly setting up the idea that eventually they would. So if we look back on that first year and really interrogate what the writers were throwing into the mix, it only serves to highlight how much they were getting away with. Because before season 1 had even reached the halfway mark, they were already exploring well beyond the scope of those foundational commitments as laid out in the series Bible. And even Lindelof's own quote about trying to keep everything grounded comes off as paying empty lip service to the network. He might not have had fully realised concepts such as time travel or shape-shifting smoke monsters in mind during the development of the first 13 episodes, but it is undeniable that the writer's room had already broken away from the fundamentals of that original pitch document. Because Lost introduced fantastical elements early on in the first half, then doubled down on them in the second half. And the proof, as they say, is in the pudding. For instance, if you watch the 4th episode Walkabout, it is difficult to deny that the show was introducing a supernatural dimension to its storytelling. We see a formerly wheelchair-bound man suddenly able to walk again. Now this simply would not have been easy to explain away in real-world terms. Sure, there have been medical cases of people's spines healing or being repaired, but Locke's spine heals instantly the moment they crash on the island. And that kind of immediate regeneration is simply impossible, and could not and would not happen in real life. It's science fiction, with emphasis on the fiction over science. In the very next episode, White Rabbit, Jack is chasing his dead father around the jungle. While this could be attributed to being a hallucination, the way the episode frames Christian's appearances suggest otherwise. And this is compounded by Jack's scene with Locke later on, who tells him the following.
Is your white rabbit a hallucination? Probably. But what if everything that happened here happened for a reason? What if this person that you're chasing is really here?
That's impossible.
Even if it is, let's say it's not.
To me, the writers are showing clear intention with this episode. Christian is not just a hallucination, and if that had been revealed as the answer to the events of this episode sometime later, I think we all would have been incredibly disappointed. Instead, the later events of the series recontextualise this moment in a much more satisfying and meaningful way, helping to bridge the strange, undefined, and uncanny mysteries of Season 1 with the more involved mythology of later seasons. Let's also not forget that Walt gets established as a child who demonstrates psychic abilities, albeit subtly. By episode 19, Deus Ex Machina, we see Locke receiving a prophetic dream to guide him to the Nigerian beechcraft. As far as I'm concerned, we've already left the realms of reality far behind. Ask yourself, what could possibly be the real-world explanation behind this? Did someone build a dream machine? Did Locke just coincidentally happen to have a dream that turned out to be accurate? I mean, come on. Lost was always leaning into the fantastical. It just had to do so with greater subtlety, and at a slower pace. But it is these genre elements that audiences responded to the most favourably as the narrative unfolded, and Season 1 was an instant smash hit from the pilot onwards. All eyes were on the project now. But Abrams was long gone, and Lindelof did not have control of his writer's room or his own imposter syndrome. There are conflicting reports about the dynamics behind the scenes of that first year, especially seeing as Lindelof was cracking under the pressure.
At the time that the ratings came in, we were writing episode 7, and I was like, they're going to make me do this 15 more times. And now everybody's watching. And it was incredibly lonely, and things didn't really shift until Carlton came along.
And when you brought him in to do the show, that lifted you out of the depression?
Yeah.
Halfway through year 1, Lindelof brought in his former boss, Carlton Cuse, to help him steady the ship. Cuse brought decades of experience with him, and became the voice of authority that the writer's room desperately needed, although this created its own disharmony amongst certain staff writers going forward. Still, writing Season 1 remained a flying by the seat of their pants experience, whilst dealing with all of the personality clashes and behind-the-scenes politics of writing and producing a TV show. There was simply no time to create a mythology. Episodes needed to be written every 8 days, with the previous scripts being shot simultaneously to keep up with the demands of the network schedule. We would come in on a Monday, looking at a big whiteboard, and the following Wednesday we'd have 55 pages of material we'd start shooting. But while we were doing that, we were brainstorming the episode that would follow, and shooting the episode that preceded, and editing the one that was 2 before that. And we would do that 25 times a year. And you're going to make mistakes, that's just going to happen. There are interviews with former staff writers and producers such as David Fury and Javier Grillo-Marxuach about how the mysteries and mythology were often in flux as they tried out different ideas and possibilities, but there were certainly grander concepts and plot points discussed very early on. Fury has talked about his work in the Lost Writers' Room during the early days and dropped a juicy revelation with this quote. There was a clue. It was originally in my episode or the episode after mine, but Claire noticed. She's been watching the stars because she's an astrologer, or astrologist, and she says, I just realised something. The island is moving. You know, she was gonna say, the stars are in the wrong place, just to indicate that the island was actually not a stationary thing. But this idea can be traced back even further than Fury's recollections, because the idea that the island was moving is actually suggested in the very first outline for the series that Lindelof ever typed up. This even predates the more fleshed out series Bible, which means the notion that the island could move was not just being talked about in year 1, it was among the first ideas generated. Now, did they know all the mechanics of that idea up front? Probably not, but the intention was absolutely there. In an interview with Lostpedia in 2008, Fury went on record with everything he knew or didn't know during his stint on Season 1. Much like Boone, he never made it to Season 2, but he contributed several key mythological episodes, including Walkabout, Solitary, and Numbers. And he reinforces the idea that during his days in the writer's room, the show was building mysteries with only vague, potential answers. There was no mythology to speak of in place during the early episodes of the series. We were building it as we went along, discussing possibilities. So, on key mysteries like the monster and the whispers, he further explained, the monster was just the great unknown threat, the imminent danger around the corner that potentially haunts us all. Some thought of it as a monster of the id, much like in Forbidden Planet, that maybe it appeared differently to everyone who saw it. The most tangible thought, as explained later by Russo, was that it functioned as a security system set up by the island's creators or early residents, whatever we later decided the answer was. For Locke, clearly, the monster was the soul of the island that was responsible for his miracle. I can't tell you what the Whispers are now, but I can tell you what they were. They were supposed to be the others, lurking in the jungle. At that time, we hadn't yet settled on what the others would be. Since they were undefined, I had imagined they were going to be more feral, gone native. Javier Grillo-Marxuach worked on both Season 1 and Season 2, and was instrumental in designing the Lost Experience ARG, which filled in a lot of backstory for the Dharma Initiative. He wrote this epic essay about his time on the show, called The Lost Will and Testament of Javier Grillo-Marxuach. It is an invaluable companion piece to the first 2 years of the show, because he details his experiences behind the scenes and with the creative process. I want to read a passage from this essay because, unlike Lindelof and Cuse, this is a former writer for the show who didn't have the most pleasant experiences working on it, and who has every reason to throw the show under the bus as a result. Yet he does the opposite when talking about the process of developing that first season, and what conversations they had from the jump. Basically, a Lost Writers' Room existed parallel to the development of the pilot, working closely with the show's creators. Most days we would sit in conference with Damon for several hours and then work from his instructions as he left the room for rewriting, notes, casting, and so on. While the pilot was being filmed in Hawaii, we would do the same and pitch our ideas to him on the phone in between takes. During these sessions, a lot of the ideas that became the show's mythology and format were discussed, pitched, and put into play for what would eventually become the series. Also, to be fair, more often than not, we were paving the way for the good ideas by coming up with a lot of bad ones. Very bad ones. On the first day alone, Damon downloaded on us the notion that the island was a nexus of conflict between good and evil, an uncharted and unchartable place with a mysterious force at its core that called humanity to it to play out a primal contest between light and dark. In that meeting, we had an assistant taking the notes I'm consulting as I write this. Damon also pitched out the idea of the Medusa Corporation, a Rand Corporation-like entity that knew the nature of the island and had thus chosen it as a place in which to perform a series of behaviour modification experiments in a series of scientific stations, and who had brought the polar bears in for these experiments. It's really quite striking to see such fundamental concepts being discussed and thought about from day one, not just the Medusa Corporation, which eventually became the Dharma Initiative, but Lindelof effectively laying out what the island would eventually be revealed as, the battleground between good and evil, as orchestrated by a mysterious force playing out a larger existential game with humanity. This force didn't have a name, nor a backstory yet, but it was embedded within the mythological DNA, hence the scene in the pilot where John Locke unintentionally articulates the nature of the big picture to come.
2 players, 2 sides. One is light, one is dark.
We'll hear more from Javier and his testament later. I don't believe that anyone should claim that Lindelof and his inaugural team knew exactly where they were headed with this behemoth narrative during year 1. Ideas and intentions were certainly discussed, with pieces set up on the board that they could play with and figure out later, leaving room for experimentation and buying some time to come up with more exciting solutions. As a result, Season 1 has a much looser framework in terms of plotting and an uneven narrative momentum. Once we hit the mid-stretch of episodes, beginning with Whatever the Case May Be, which comes directly after Claire's abduction and the reveal of other people living on the island, you can really feel the story coming to a sudden halt, as if they needed to hit the pause button because things were happening too fast for them to really keep up with. Several of these middle episodes reset to being character-centric again, and while we learn new backstories of characters, it often feels like filler. This is a problem we would also see affecting the middle run of Season 2 and the first half of Season 3. I often find it ironic that those who once loved and now besmirch the show almost always cite Season 1 as being when the series was at its finest. But the reality is that Season 1 is the only real time in the show when the writers had no concrete idea of what the answers to the mysteries they were raising were actually going to be. The reason I think so many critics champion the first season is because it was still a mystery box that they could fill with their own theories and imaginations. The show was more focused on the human drama, and its future was still filled with potential. I don't think it's a coincidence that these same viewers started really disliking and feeling alienated by the show exactly around the point when it started to pick a direction of travel. And as the show gradually revealed what was behind many of its earlier mysteries and moved towards computers that were saving the world and ghostly spectres and manifestations, it moved away from hunting boar and building rafts. The weird island stuff was brought into the foreground, which is why a portion of viewers soured on the story and developed this intense nostalgia for that first season, back when things were simpler and any answers still felt possible. But the fact remains, Season 1 was the least planned out season from the entire Lost canon. It's a contradiction to say you dislike the show for being made up without any planning, yet still claiming its first season was its best. So, when exactly did the writers really figure out where they were going with this thing? Well, it was only after the finale that the writers had room to breathe and the time to delve deeper into what this show was going to be, and to lay the tracks down for what was to come. Between Season 1 and Season 2, they developed the mythology more in depth, and fleshed out many of those cool ideas that they had bounced around the room. Due to the consistently huge ratings, the immensely positive reactions from critics and audiences around the world, and winning the Best Drama Series award at the Emmys, the writers' room was finally afforded some latitude by the network, and Lindelof and Cuse were now trusted enough to run with their more wilder ideas. Lindelof explains, "Between the first and second season, we started to cook the deeper mythology of the island and started talking about the physics of the island, how the island worked, why no one could find the island, who had been on the island before, and what the other's story was and how long they had been there. In those conversations we started talking about the wheel and the idea that the island was moving, not just through space but also through time. And then the question just became, when are we going to use that device? I do feel like we always knew we were going to do time travel on the show, and we were setting that up as early as the second season." Again, let's not just take his word for it. Do we have any in-show evidence that bears out such claims? Well, what do we know for sure that was introduced in the second season that became cornerstone parts of the narrative going forward? Well, first and foremost, the electromagnetic light beneath the island was introduced, and this ended up being the macro answer to a lot of the mysteries on the island. As we find out later, this energy is essentially the primary power responsible for everything that happens. And this seed had actually been planted back in the first season, with the scene between Jack and Saeed discussing the compass and how its magnetic pull was being thrown off by some other force.
Correct. That's where north should be. Yet that is north.
I'm not...
A minor magnetic anomaly might explain a variance of 2 or 3 degrees, but not this.
Other substantial parts of the mythology that were established include the others being a more advanced society than they appear to be. At this point, the writers knew that they were not island savages, and were in fact technologically superior to our Losties in every way. We even meet the leader of the others and start to peel back the layers of their hierarchy. Later in the season finale, the writers set up Charles Widmore as an antagonistic force, a man who is not only searching for the island, but will turn out to have once been in charge of its people. This idea is tied into Desmond's backstory, and we discover that his former flame and Charles's daughter Penny is searching for the island, a plot point that would pay off across the next 2 seasons. The smoke monster's functionality was explored as well, scanning memories and downloading the pasts of the people it encounters. We were seeing how the monster has a degree of sentience and was more than simply a killing machine. The Dharma Initiative was set up here with allusions to a catastrophic incident, both of which would be hugely fundamental pieces of the island's backstory that we would actually see play out and spend a great deal of time exploring in later seasons. We got clues to the Egyptian history as well, not just with the timer in the hatch, but the four-toed statue that would turn out to have incredible significance to the plot, and we'd even find out how it came to be just a foot rather than a complete statue. Even the idea of an afterlife existing, where people go when they die, and sometimes come back from, is sowed very early on in Season 2 episode Question Mark, with Charlotte Malkin's message from Yemi to Mr. Echo.
I saw him when I was between places.
All of these massive mythological plot points are delivered in Year 2. I need to say that again. All of these massive mythological plot points are delivered in Year 2. So the writers undeniably had developed a good sense of where they were heading by this point, which is why Season 2 has more revelations featured within it, because they understood more about the island, how it worked, its backstory, and how they were going to drip feed it all to the audience over time. They knew what the answers to many of both these old and new mysteries were and where they wanted to take them, but they always maintained that this was a roadmap, not an unchangeable blueprint. It allowed space for detours and redirects along the way, sometimes even complete U-turns. According to the Lost Will and Testament of Javier Grillo Marxuach, as questions of mythology and backstory came up during the development of Lost, Damon and the staff, first in the think tank and later in the writer's room for the series, would come up with explanations. The ones Damon liked just enough to not dismiss outright would be discussed at greater length, and eventually something would become a kind of operating theory. Damon would eventually declare it's going to be that unless someone can beat it. When we finally refined these ideas to the point where Damon was okay putting them on screen, committing to them as canon, then we would incorporate them into the show. So basically the rule in the writer's room was, if anyone can approve upon the current answer we have planned for something, then we will reconfigure it. The roadmap was adjusted as they drove along the route, and this is why multiple mysteries with seemingly simple answers become more involved and complicated as the show progresses. For example, the smoke monster very much sounds and behaves like a machine in that first season, and is even described as such by Rousseau, a security system. Even in Season 2 there are clues that suggest the monster is man-made, and it certainly looks like a nanobot cloud, presumably inspired from Michael Crichton's book Prey, which is all about a sentient nanobot cloud. In fact, Abrams originally dubbed the Lost Island as Crichton Island, because he envisioned going hard on the science fiction to explain things. Javier's Lost Testament document once again provides us some much needed clarity on the battle between the writer's room to establish an ambitious mythology and the network's allergy to anything being explained in ways that they disliked. Here's his take on the smoke monster. In the think tank, we imagined it as a security system, which eventually became Rousseau's line, and a sort of mechanism of judgment that policed the island on behalf of the strange powers that ran the place, and called out the good and evil in humanity to come. As the smoke monster would come and go through the first season, and, for example, have a face-off with Locke, but decide to not kill him, we would say that the smoke monster possessed an intuitive psychic ability like the sentient ocean in Solaris, and would be able to look into the souls of its prey in order to determine further action. Up until the time when I left the show, this idea, and variations on it, were the common language of the writers when discussing the monster. But as far as I know, this explanation was never expressed in series, because Damon never became fully comfortable with it. Again, this was partially because in the early days, any explanation that felt too fanciful would be kiboshed by the network. Since ABC seemed comfortable in having the monster without us actually explaining it, leaving well enough alone seemed a better course of action than to risk the network pulling at strands that would take apart even larger swaths of our story sweater. So there was this constant push-pull over how far they could go with their revelations, even throughout Season 2, which is a season already full of bold sci-fi concepts. Unfortunately, the idea that the smoke monster could be a sentient, psychic, elemental force was simply too metaphysical for a network that was also producing light entertainment fare like Desperate Housewives. Eventually, the writers did strike a balance on how to explore and explain the smoke monster. We see pieces of its powers across 6 seasons, and a very slow setup for it becoming the big bad of the series. But it wouldn't be until the writers had their final 3 seasons locked into place that they would start to unveil that plan. In my opinion, the notion that the smoke monster was simply a security system was upended as far back as Season 3 episode The Cost of Living.
You speak to me as if I were your brother.
When we clearly see that not only is there a direct connection drawn between Old Smokey and the apparitions of the dead, but that it also has a will and an intention behind its actions. More crucially, it can be malicious and manipulative. It is cruel to Mr. Echo. And so we go from something that was hinted at as being mechanical in nature in Seasons 1 and 2 to being more elemental and supernatural, with its own identity hidden beneath the mask of the dead, but slowly starting to emerge to show us its true face and its true colours. Lindelof and Cuse have spoken at length about how they were constantly asking ABC for an end date from almost the beginning, because they knew that a mystery show must eventually answer its mysteries, or else the audience will, surprise surprise, abandon ship. As Year 3 began, the writers once again petitioned the ABC executives for an end date, this time under the threat that they would quit the show by the end of the season, and new showrunners would need to be brought in.
그렇다면 더 이상 회장님 밑에서 일할 수가 없습니다. 그만두겠습니다.
So very early on, you know, certainly early in Season 2, we began lobbying for an end date for the show because we realized that eventually, if we had a destination, our airplane was going to get there, but we were just going to have to keep circling it until we ran out of gas. And we all know what happens. It's not the nicest landing. So, but the network was obviously looking at it as the show is still a hit. Everybody's watching it. It's unheard of to announce an end date for a show this far in advance.
Lindelof and Cuse couldn't follow their roadmap or give the story a sense of propulsion without having the final destination clearly marked on the horizon. For this serialised story to remain coherent and purposeful, the writers needed to know how long they had to keep the creative engine running, how much mystery gas was left in the tank, and how much storytelling road was still left to cover. But ABC wanted the journey to run forever. They would keep the show going until it started to dive in ratings. So the writers had to play for time, and therefore could not drive their story towards a conclusion. It had to keep going, and going, and going, which is why new mysteries, both large and minor, are frequently introduced to compensate for the fact that they were burning through storylines fast.
These flashbacks are finite, you know? You can do like 3 flashbacks of Jack getting drunk and like being self-destructive, but ultimately that stuff, the first one feels like an origin story because you're learning about that person for the very first time. But all the other ones feel like you're just kind of treading water.
Yeah, we didn't know whether the mythology had to last 2 years or like 8 years, you know, so that was kind of where we, you know, and that was the key point, you know, and then we started doing episodes in Season 3 where the guys were locked in cages, and it was, I think, because we metaphorically felt like we were locked in cages. And
there's no metaphorical about it.
Yeah.
And this is what led, in my opinion, to many of the convolutions in the narrative and the peaks and valleys in quality throughout the first half of the series. There are only so many flashbacks you can think up that will feel fresh and insightful, and there are only so many ways of avoiding answering the big questions, which is why we get a long arc of characters being trapped in cages, the perfect metaphor for how the writers felt.
Carlton and I both had 2-year deals that ended after Season 2. And so we were now negotiating for the future of the show. And so neither side blinked. And so we agreed to sign a 1-year extension, Carlton and I, with the understanding that we'd be leaving at the end of the 3rd season and someone else would be running the show.
And this is why Season 3 gave us divisive episodes about Jack's tattoos, and meandering side quests to save people from polar bears, or the restoration of Dharma vans. I don't hate these episodes like some people do. I actually think there are important scenes and moments in all of them that help to push the narrative or the characters forward, albeit in small steps. Upon being asked by a savvy journalist what they would have done differently with those first 3 seasons had an end date been enshrined from day one, Lindelof had this to say: "I think there would have been a lot more confidence in the storytelling, particularly in seasons 2 and 3. There's a stutter-step feel to season 2 and the first part of season 3, where you take 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and then 1 step forward. Even though the storytelling was emotionally based, we'd realised that we didn't need to do 25 episodes in a year, we only needed to do 17. For us, the big win wasn't just setting an end date, it was also that the remaining seasons would have a reduced episodic order, so you could never get to a point where you're like, wow, we really want to activate the endgame of the season, but we're 7 episodes away from that, so we need to just do a rollicking boar hunting episode." That being said, some of my favourite episodes of the show are ones like Hurley in the Van, which doesn't advance the plot in any way at all, except that they find Ben's dad. That's cool. But did you really need any of it? I think that's what would have been different. If we'd known we could be 6 and out, we wouldn't have done 25 episode seasons. The narrative would have been a lot tighter. But I wonder if those episodes like finding the Dharma bus would have existed, so I don't know that I would go back and change it.
It's our job to look forwards because we know exactly where we're going and how much story we have. But once we reach the point where we can no longer continue to work towards something and we're just working, you're going to see it.
So we're going to have to switch gears at it. We can introduce new characters who have new flashback stories, but people are invested in the old ones. So we're seeing about 8 chess moves ahead, and it ain't going to end pretty. And they just didn't agree with us.
There is no denying that this first half of Season 3 is often cited as the point when casual viewers started checking out. Even hardcore fans felt that the show was starting to spin its wheels, and the ratings began to waver as a result. And the executives behind the scenes finally understood what the showrunners had been warning against. This was going to go from following a roadmap to a massive, messy pile-up on the ideas highway.
And then the audience started responding, oh my God, the show's going nowhere. And then the network started saying, oh my God, those guys are right. And it wasn't a told you so moment. It was basically, they decided to end the show based on the fact that creatively, exactly what you're talking about, the absence of a plan and the idea that we were having to spin our wheels became very apparent.
And then they finally came to the table and we had a real conversation about like, okay, so they were like, we have agreed to let you end the show. So the agreement was we landed on 6 with less episodes to give us more time in between seasons to sort of plan things out. And then, of course, the 4th season was cut short by the writer's strike. But everything else kind of went relatively according to design.
So the showrunners finally got their wish. The show would end at Season 6, with a final order of 48 episodes agreed upon. It is worth noting just how unheard of this was at the time. A mega successful show, announcing it was ending, and providing a countdown to its series finale. And you can really see and feel the difference in pacing between the meandering nature of those first 3 seasons, and the purposeful structure and intent of the final 3. The end was now in sight, and we were all headed there together. When recalling the reactions to Season 3 episode Stranger in a Strange Land, Lindelof said this: "We can't go back and apologise for the creative mistakes that we made, because we had to make them. If that episode hadn't been made, we weren't able to get a notes call that said, we don't like this episode, and where we could then say, we don't like it either, but it's the best we can do if we're not moving the story forward. And we're now at a point, guys, where we can't move the story forward." And they asked, well, what would you do if we allowed you an end date? And we said, give us an end date and we'll tell you what we'll do. And the conversations then reached a new pitch. Everything has to happen the way it happened. That's a familiar phrase.
Whatever happened, happened.
Yeah, thanks anyway, Plato.
In the next part, we shall explore the last half of the series, including what the endgame plan was, how the writers' strike and unforeseen production problems affected the show, and examining what lies were actually told by the writers, if any. Please like, share and subscribe to keep this channel alive, or consider donating to my Patreon to help me make more videos just like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you back on the island.